So let's have a look at the contents and then I'll talk a little bit about construction. And so there it is, guys. Not a lot of these going about. If you want them, hunt them down on eBay, see what you can do, but lovely resin bases and some classic metal sculpts. You can see I've got these laid out already, but it's worthwhile having a look, for instance, at the staff base. It's got a nice little radio there, a little submachine gun, nice little wall for everyone to hide behind. Very nice, very nice. And as well as you've got these resin bases here. Of particular note is a little round of cheese that their guys are getting tucked into there. You know, these are lovely little touches. And you can't see it at the moment because of the blue tack, but there's what we would call in Scotland a deid cow. That's a dead cow. Or it might just be having a rest, but considering the noise of the gunfire, I think it's probably dead, to be honest. I think they'll be having some beef to go with their cheese later on. So, lots and lots of infantry, or gun crews, sorry, to be painted. The good thing is they are quite simple. There's not a lot to them. They're basically just uniform. They don't have a lot of equipment on them. So the main thing of note here is the guns, getting them assembled before we move on to the painting. Now I assemble these by, as you can tell what the blue tack is, by putting them together in situ on a base. That way I know that everything's fitting right. The wheels are aligned to the ruts, the trails and the spades are aligned to the indentations on the ground. If you do all of that, also check all your crew fitting for where they're going to go to make sure that the bases aren't too big. That can happen sometimes. If you do all that, then it means you don't have any problems later on and try to work with painted miniatures to make them fit the bases. So when I was gluing these together, I started with the trails and the wheels, using blue tack to hold them in place, and then gluing the wheels on with deid, which gives you a really, really strong bond. I mean, it's a filler as well as an adhesive, but it takes a long time to dry. So the blue tack holds things in place. And then the next day at the earliest, I would then attach the gun shield to the gun, and then once again using deid, attach it to the trails and support it in place with blue tack once again, so that it's straight through the centre and at the right elevation that we need. So, whoops, we can peel off the blue tack. Sometimes it doesn't want to come off, but you just dab at it and it'll come away. And there we go. We've got a nicely deided gun that'll be protected to a great extent on the base, but it's not going to have any unfortunate little components popping off like you can get with super glue if you for instance drop it or drop the bag that you're carrying it in. So you see that fits quite nice. It may be that some guns will only fit certain bases, so just be careful of that, just the way that the indentations are placed. But we're now ready to move on to painting. So I'll be starting with the guns using the airbrush. Oh, and worth pointing out that these need a good scrub. They're covered in little flecks of resin dust and things, so give them a good scrub well in advance of any painting that you've got planned. Make sure they're scrubbed and nice and dry. But as I said, on to the airbrushing next for these lovely guns. I've given the guns an undercoat of German Camo dark green, and now I'm giving them a coat of German Camo olive green. I'm trying to leave some shade near the bottom of panels and in between the different components of the barrel, for instance, underneath the trails. And then you can see what it looks like with that initial coat on, some shade and some highlight. So now I'm giving it a coat of German Camel Bright Green as a highlight. So I'm just hitting the top areas of panels, along the top of the barrel, the top of the trails again, the ends of the spades, so that we're getting a modulated effect. The light down towards the dark, creating that bit of depth. And there you can see the guns again. We have left the gloss varnish to dry overnight. I always feel it's safer to leave it to dry for 24 hours or thereabouts, just to make sure it's nice and firm. You're going to be applying, as you'll see, an enamel product to it, which shouldn't affect it because it's acrylic paint, but it can still do so, and that's particularly the case if you're going to use Tamiya varnish, the Tamiya Clear. So I've left it to dry, and now I'm ready to do the pin wash. Now we're using, as I said, an enamel product. There's lots and lots out there. One's pretty much as good as the other. How I'm going to apply this though is I'm going to use the palette here. Now the reason for that is, if I can even open the bottle, is that even though this is really quite thin, it's still thicker than we want it to be. If I put that in the palette, hopefully you can see that it's still quite thick, and I want it to go on really thin, and I want it to flow really well. So let's clean that brush a bit. I am going to add a little bit of thinner to the palette, and that's why I'm using the palette. So just using a big brush, I'm lifting some out of the pot. Usually a couple of lifts, so to speak, is enough for the amount of paint I would add to that palette. And then I can give it a mix. Now, just a wee hint for you folks, a wee tip: these kind of bottles are really easy to spill. Everybody who owns one has probably spilt one at one time, but see, it's not moving anywhere, and that's just a bit of blue tack underneath it. I've seen lots of things you can buy, you know, to keep it from spilling, knocking over. Bit of blue tack, and if you still knock it over, then you've just been a wee bit careless. So I'll give that a mix up, and then I'll change shot to something closer in so you can see the pin wash being applied. But I'll see if I can just show you there. See how watery that is? That's what we're after. I'm trying to apply the wash along features, into recesses. It's going on really thin, so we don't have to be ultra careful here. But the more careful you are, the less cleanup you're going to have. Now you can see it's not a terribly stark kind of shade we're putting on, but it will be defined. And I start to wash it off when it's still wet. I don't wait until it dries, or gets nearly dry rather. Like some people, I start to wash it back into the recesses and off of the flat areas without any real delay, to try and get as bright a finish as possible. You can also touch up again if you need to with some more wash. I'm going back over the edges, the more defined features as well on the guns, with some olive green and some German camel bright green as required, just to brighten things up a bit after the wash. And we really stand to create some highlights at this point as well. It doesn't have to be a super precise process, it actually helps if it is a little bit soft. I don't use a particularly detailed brush at this point. I'm just hitting edges. I don't want to wear out a good quality brush by doing this kind of edge highlighting, and I can also touch up areas of the figure where the paint has been removed during the handling process, which is almost inevitable for these metal guns. And you can put the paint on quite soft when you're doing that as well, folks. And here's some chipping going on. That helps bring together the various layers of modulation, as well as it helps brighten up edges and little features. I will add some dark cores to these chips later on with some German Camel dark brown. You see, it's thin lines. Try not to be too symmetric or too predictable on how you're making them look. Keep them varied. Before you paint any of the crew, I recommend you dry fit them to the holes in the bases. Some of these individually sculpted resin bases don't fit the crews as well as they might. I don't know if that's just a production issue or a scaling issue once they have done the sculpting, but these guys all fit really nice. There's a bit of space around them as well that will help with the filler that I use to attach the figures to the base. Only one type of figure needed trimming, and this guy with a wide stance on his legs, he just needed the front of his base just clipped off, and he fits in really nice. So I'll start the painting, and I will begin by giving them all an undercoat of German Camo black brown. An overall undercoat of German Camo black brown, and then using Panzerace's Old Wood, I'm going to create the main colour for the uniform. And you can see me blocking in colours, putting in lines, which I will then use to guide me towards the finished look. This is going to take 2 coats of paint. It's quite a light paint over a dark undercoat. So we're going to need a couple of coats of paint. You can, if you wish, use a first coat of US Field Drab if you want a softer transition between that dark undercoat and the Old Wood. But you can see how I'm just blocking things in, looking for the shape in the uniform. Where there isn't any shape and I want to see a fold or a bit of shade, I'll just paint that in, basically paint a line. So a lot of this is about painting blobs and lines and then working up towards the finished look. And remember to paint all the way around things like arms and legs. They are 3-dimensional. You don't want to leave too much shade in between all the features or it becomes too dominant. And then you can go back over to give it a second coat and to firm up all of the shape that you want to create. Now the highlight is Iraqi sand, and I'm very carefully placing this not just on high points or dividing lines between the uniform and such likes, but also between shade and main colour. It really helps create the depth, makes that border you've created really pop and create the shape of the finished look that we're after. And you see it's really small lines. Make sure your brush, the paint on the brush is sufficiently wet to flow off the brush, not drag off the brush, but not so wet that you're going to end up with it pooling off the brush and covering the figure. You want nice neat lines. And you'll soon, with just 3 layers of paint, soon have a very well defined looking figure. The boots have been undercoated black and be given a little bit of a highlight of German camel grey. And then little bits of equipment are green grey with highlight of splinter camo base from Panzer Aces. Nice simple colours, but they contrast really well. Just prepping the brush there. Little lines, once again, putting the shade as much as possible between the highlight as much as possible between the shade and the main colour. I'm using the same colours for the helmet as I used to airbrush the guns. I've also painted some red epaulets on the shoulders there. That's a nice bright eye-catching point. If I can keep this in shot, you can see I'm just putting a wee highlight on, just enough to catch the eye, and then the skin is German Camel Pale Brown, and then I use Game Colour Bronze Flesh Tone with a highlight of Model Colour Flat Flesh. And when you're painting faces, I tend to paint down the middle of the face, tend to do nose and then mouth and chin and then cheeks and ears. Just create the shape of a face that the eye is going to recognise. We're very good at seeing faces, let's get it on there and it will stand out. The walls have been undercoated with US Olive Drab. It's a nice dark stony kind of colour, and then given a coat of track primer from Panzer Aces, which is a slightly lighter but good stony kind of colour. You can see we're just building up a little bit of shape and depth there. And then we're going on to London Grey. We're going to paint some of the stones with London Grey. It's good to leave some of the stones with the track primer on there, so you're getting a bit of variety. Not all the stones are going to be the same. I think I painted all of them on this little bit with the London Grey, but on the other walls there's some track primer being left. And we're getting a nice stony kind of colour here that isn't necessarily just grey. Excuse me being off camera there, folks. And then we've got some deck tan or splinter camo base, those kind of light colours, just as a bit of a highlight on the top of some of the stones, just to really catch the eye and help define that shape. So now to the deid coup. It's had an undercoat of German Camel Black Brown, but now I'm blocking in some grey for where I want the white to be, leaving some of that black brown for the deepest area of shade. And I was watching cows out the window of the train on the commute to work, so this is kind of based on a cow that I saw there. Instead of just doing the standard black and white cow, I'm going for a white and brown cow. Once again, creating shape and then going back in to toughen up those shapes, get them looking more firm. And the brown is just flat earth. I want to leave some of the darkest shade between the flat earth and the grey. And just like before with the uniform, I'm just starting to look at prominent features, finding them, painting in lines and in blocks, so that I can start to create a bit of texture, you know, a bit of some fold, some shade. And then, as always, for these things you need another coat, folks, so don't be putting it on too thick and expecting to do it all in a winner. And then we're on to some white. locking in colours, leaving some of that grey. White is a tricky colour, as you probably know, folks, so get the paint on thin and take a couple of coats once again to get it on. Putting any kind of white paint on thick is usually a recipe for disaster, because the pigment will just gather. So I'll get it on thin and let it dry, and then get another coat on. Now, whilst that white is drying, I am using Panzerace's Highlight German Field Grey 2. But any kind of brown, suitable kind of brown colour will do, folks. And you can see it's a lot more of a streaky application here compared to the first coat. And you could again add another highlight on top of that if you wanted for certain features, but I was quite happy with this as it was, and without getting it looking too bright and gaudy looking. In the hoofs I'm just using that field grey colour again with a wee highlight just to help define them, and then it's back in for the white. Missed a leg at the back, it's not uncommon to miss something, but another coat of white paint when you're nice in control to get a nice smooth finish. The undercoat of that white paint is dried. And here we have our deid coup. The boxes I'm painting first with, well, over an undercoat of German Camo Black Brown, I'm painting first a coat of Panzerace's Light Mud. It's a really light kind of sort of raw wooden kind of colour that will look dissimilar from the ground, dissimilar from the uniforms, but still look right. It's going to take a couple of coats to do this once again, and I'm following the panels, leaving shade between the panels around all those many interesting objects that's sitting on top, and we'll come to them in a moment. Oh, a wee bit of a spill there, I just remove that with a bit of water on the brush, and we're back in. So after I gave it another coat, I'm now giving it a highlight of deck tan. I'm going to try and hit all the edges of those panels and top lines of them, and just try and make them pop. Once again, make sure the brush is flowing, the paint's flowing nice and evenly and smoothly off that brush. It's got to get the right finish, the right mixture, sorry, in the paint. And then certain features I am painting black, anything that's going to be metallic, because I'm going to be painting it grey. So black to start, and then moving on to the German grey. With a highlight of London grey. And there's a nice round of cheese there, folks. I love the bit of detail, so that's tan yellow. I'm just going straight in with London grey on these. But I'm assuming the cups are like, they've got handles on them, look like tiny buckets, but there'll be some kind of cup. And there's a wee highlight on the German grey on the hinges. Some deck tan, just to get a bit of metallic glint to the cups and the cutlery. And also I've used some of that eventually to paint the open bit of the cheese round. Next I'm going to fix the figures to the bases. And then the bases, once that they've been touched up, will be pretty much done, except you can see here, there's footprints, there's hoof prints from the cow, so I'm going to pick them out later. And I'll show you that, but I've decided I'm going to fix the figures to the bases, tidy up around them, and then I don't have to worry about doing some extra detail which then gets covered up by the filler. This is the filler I'm going to use. It's also what I'm going to use to attach the figures to the bases. I've done it here on this staff team already. Basically put a little, I'll show you in a second, but put a little bit of filler into the hole, push the figure in, the excess kind of rises up around the base, and then just with an old brush I just push that down and texture it, and then it'll be ready for painting with the earth colour again. These guys here don't have any kind of scenic bases. They're getting super glued on just now. Then I'll use just some typical kind of plaster type filler before covering it with that and painting it with the same paint for these. So I'll show you this, how I do it. It's nice and simple, neat and tidy. If you control how much you're putting on, you can control how much you're needing to work with around the figures. So using my usual kind of mixing and pasting kind of tool, I'm just filling these recesses, trying to keep it more towards the outside edge than in the middle. You don't want to put too much, but once again, not enough is also going to be a problem. So just get it in, guys. You've got, if you're doing these or doing this on the new plastic bases, you'll get plenty of practice for how much is the right amount for the figures you're using, and that will be different depending on what figure you're using. But you can see it all squeezing up there. That's what we want. That means the figure is going to be well and truly gripped by the paste that's in the hole. And then with a brush, because this is acrylic, with an old brush, you can start moving the paste around, making sure that all the recesses are full, get as smooth as possible transition over onto the base itself, and cover up some of the metallic base whilst you're at it. And if need be, you can always add more when the original layer of paste is dried. But it's as simple as that, folks. Nothing too complex, and I'll leave it to dry overnight. That's the filler dried, painted, and I'll quickly show you these as well. I used just some standard plaster type filler to build up the base to the level of the figures bases, and then covered it in the same Vallejo paste for a similar kind of finish. And so once it's dried, I painted it. You may find there's a little bit of shrinkage. You can touch that up or just cover it up with grass, as I've done here. And I've put a mixture of light and dark grasses and flock down with some clumps. So leaves us just one, well, two final steps. First of all, you can see there's a lot of footprints and cow hoof prints along here, so it makes sense for us to accentuate them, and I'm going to do that with a little bit of an enamel wash. You can use acrylic washes, but enamels are just that much more thinner and more subtle. That's why I like them. And then I'm going to do a bit of pigment work on the wheels of the gun and the trails, and a little bit on the shield. So I'm going to start with the pigments. So we have a little tray that I use. I'll just come out a bit now. For mixing up my pigments, I do not apply pigments dry directly to the miniature. You may see people doing that with large scale model kits, and that's fine because there's a lot of area to work on. But in something this small, if you put it on dry, you're going to have no control over it. So I work it with a palette just as you would with paint. Now, there's enough dried pigment here that just needs it reactivated with a bit of water. And a bit of water just to make it a bit more runny, and we're good to go. It's not a very difficult process, this. You just got to make sure you keep it even. I'm using dark earth pigments on the wheel, just get them looking a bit muddy, as if it's wetter and fresher earth. You know, when it's been wheeled into position. Simple as that. And then the other wheel. Don't put too much on, folks. You can see how small the amounts are that I'm working with here. if you put on, oh my goodness, the gun's come off, folks, there you go, that's not very good, but it'll make this stage a bit easier for me. I wanted to have these glued in place and then the pigments applied in place. There's less handling of the figure that way because it's metal, which means it's quite vulnerable to chipping. Okay, so that's the dark pigment, and then I'm going to apply some lighter pigment to the trails. So I'm just going to reactivate some of this lighter pigment, make sure I'm not taking too much so it's nice and thin, and for this really just have to put a little wash around here and that's it. And then if I can avoid touching the wheels, this is why I wanted to do it on the base. Then I'm going to add some to the lower parts of the gun shield. And then I'm going to let it dry. Less is more, as I said with pigments, folks. The more you put on, the harder it is to shift it if you put on too much. Just going to touch up that wheel. So, I'm going to take a smaller brush just now, go to one that I did earlier. Now, look, hopefully you can see this bit of dusting around the lower parts of the gun shield. Just a slightly damp brush and just soften it, pull it around where you want it. I'm not doing any streaking on these, but you could draw some of that up. I'll try and show you here, like just going like that. Just draw some of that up. Excuse my tapping. Soften it down a bit. You know, and you can work it like that. Normally I would apply this before matte varnish, but I wanted these on the bases before I did it, and it'll be quite safe and secure without any concern about it being rubbed off, as long as it don't fall off like you just seen. If it was a tank that's going to be handled, I would want to put the pigments on after, before the varnish. Just covering up a little bit of super glue there. And you can see that's starting to dry now. It's a nice subtle effect that adds a bit more depth to the finished look. So let's go over to the enamel wash. Give this a good shake. And then I'm going to be taking a small brush with very small amounts on it. You can hardly even see it on the brush because we don't want to overdo this. And I'm just going to let it run into all these little hoof prints and footprints. You know, the detail that's in here is part of what makes this box set unique, so we should try to find them, bring them out, and let the viewer see them. Helps to tell the story of where the guns have been positioned. It's as simple as that, nothing more to it. If I can keep that on camera. Now let me see, is one I did earlier. So this one I did earlier, I am going to add another little bit. And I'm just touching it against these recessed areas. Enamel's obviously going to take longer than acrylics to dry because of oil based, but this is so thin that they dry really quite quick, so that you can add another coat quite safely. And there's one more. Just add another little bit. Get the benefit of all the sculptor's imagination and hard work. And actually what I'll do here, you can see this is got quite dry pigments now, so I've got a slightly damp brush. Just want to soften it. I can draw it up a bit. But we're just softening it down, getting in here. So you're basically doing like a blending job. It's really quite easy and simple. You can reactivate it with water. And as I said, normally I would fix this with a coat of varnish, but it's not really needed because it won't get handled. So there you go, folks. I will now put up some pictures of the completed platoon in a little slideshow, and you can have a look and hopefully enjoy. Thank you for watching.